Welcome to the latest episode of Ready, Steady, Green. In this podcast, we're discussing challenges and opportunities of turning climate awareness to climate action. In other words, making sustainability sustainable. We will be focusing on young people as they are the ones who are and will be most affected by the global challenges of today and tomorrow. This is not intended to be a specialist podcast to sustainability experts. Instead, it rather aims to broaden the discourse and help everyone realize how closely the topic of sustainability and specifically climate is connected to their health, quality of life, quality of chances, technological advancements, and so on. The episodes from Ready, Steady, Green aim to inspire everyone to step up and step out in their lives and in their community.
Not much direct kind of reporting or features or news on climate change as such. However, there's so much reporting on issues, burning issues that are related to this crisis, which is a multiple crisis instead. Let's put some beehives on our roof and talk about it and create a beautiful story about Jill, who's now supervising those bees. All right. So that is a very functionalistic, a very managerial or pragmatic approach to communication and also to storytelling. And then storytelling becomes reduced to being a tool where information is wrapped in a beautiful way and hopefully sticks with people much more than compared to giving them the numbers. But firstly, this one academic who's not flying anymore does something because he confronts everyone else to at least have this moment of hesitation, this moment of irritation, thinking,
So I'm pleased to welcome in today's show Franzisca Weder. Franzisca is a professor in Organisational and Sustainability Communications at the Department of Business Comms at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. She has over 20 years of experience in researching, writing, and teaching about organizational communications, public relations, with a very strong focus on sustainability communication. Before joining Vienna University, Franzisca worked as an associate professor at the University of Queensland and the University of Klagenfurt. So welcome to this podcast, Franzisca.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm very pleased to welcome you on my show. We have known each other for quite a long while, and I'm very pleased that after being a guest on your Sounds Like Sustainability podcast, I'm able to invite you now to Ready, Steady, Green. So let me start with a question which I noticed in the last couple of months or maybe 1 or 2 years. I believe climate change is not that hot topic on the public agenda than it was, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. Do you agree with this? And if so, why is it that?
That is a good question right at the beginning to dive into something that is definitely super interesting. I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I think there are two things or two phenomena overlapping. And one is that, yes, I would say we did have a bit of a peak in climate change reporting. It was a time where especially media corporations started to find this relevant and somehow urgent, and therefore they made an issue out of it. I think now things are a bit different, and not in terms of climate change now being pushed off the public agenda. I would rather say the whole phenomena of the climate crisis, which it actually is, has become so complex that it's really hard to detect the reporting that directly talks about climate change. So we might feel, okay, there's not much direct kind of reporting or features or news on climate change as such. However, there's so much reporting on issues, burning issues that are related to this crisis, which is a multiple crisis instead. So that would probably be my quick and dirty diagnosis of what you just described.
Actually, I fully understand and agree with what you're saying, even more so that one of our earlier guests, actually the first guest on this series of podcasts, Attila Schillinger, who's a professor of sustainability communications at the University of Oregon, he was speaking quite a bit about the age of polycrisis, where young people are buried and facing so many challenges at the same time that it's very difficult to actually separate these crises and separate these challenges from each other. So how can a young person then actually address these, or what can they do about their own lives to make it more sustainable and more manageable for themselves?
So maybe before I get to the point to share a couple of ideas how people can relate to sustainability, I would answer the first half or the first bit of the question: how can young people relate to what is happening there? And this is probably the biggest challenge if we want to stick for a minute thinking about what is out there in the media. And if we're talking about mass media, if we're talking about newspapers and big magazines and those news shows that are still around on TV, then I think it's really, really hard to relate, and especially hard for young folks to relate to what is happening there, those big topics, big crises. And there the complexity is only, rarely broken down to a level that people can actually relate to that. So that's the tough bit. But the good news is that there is an increasing number of more sustainability related stories. And I say stories very consciously, because I think if the topic is sustainability, if you think about stories about fast fashion, if you think about stories about poverty, about a project where a school won a prize because they started to pick up litter from and waste and things from the beaches, then these projects are plotted, they are told as a beautiful story, and then it's much easier to relate to that than, as I said, a very distant reports on a massive flooding potentially happening in an area or a region on this globe that people don't feel too much related to.
So if we are speaking then about actual first-hand experience for young people about climate change, would that mean that they personally have to see, feel, experience, suffer from some of these extremes that we are facing? Because that is something very difficult to model. So if one thinks about education, we cannot bring people to, suffer of floods or, well, perhaps it happens anyway, but one cannot actually plan for it on purpose. How can we handle this?
It's a tricky or potentially very challenging idea to create those experiences, especially for those people who never experienced something like a very strong wind, heat that actually goes beyond the 35 degrees that we now have in summer. I think by the same time, we do have a lot of possibilities to create situations where a very similar feeling can be created in a play, in a form of, like, we have so many opportunities now with the technology, with augmented reality and all that stuff. I think that is one way. And the other way is really to create stories that help people to identify with something, even if they didn't really experience something by themselves. I do believe that there's a certain power and a certain strength in really good stories. You read a book where you felt like, oh my God, like this felt so close, and it's stuck with you for much longer, even when you finished the book. So there are those stories, there are those heroes or anti-heroes, or I don't know, those figures that you identify with. And I think that is a really good way. It's not this kind of direct or maybe simplistic way of creating a scenario where people can actually experience a flood, can actually experience heat going beyond 40, beyond 45 degrees. But I think with really good storytelling, you can make people part of the experience.
I remember actually you did write somewhere, maybe even some academic research was conducted around storytelling, the role of storytelling in sustainability, or how can one picture or envisage sustainability through impactful storytelling. Can you share one or a few ideas on what makes a sustainability story stick, if I may put it this way?
From my experiences, stories, like we can, as researchers, and then of course as the ones who open up classrooms and learning environments, as educators and teachers, I think we can approach this from two different ways. And this is something that pops up in pretty much all my research. We can approach storytelling from a very functionalistic perspective. Say, hey, storytelling is an amazing tool. We have those complex issues out there, like working for a corporation. We need to talk about our CO2 emissions, and it's really tough. Let's put some beehives on our roof and talk about it and create a beautiful story about Jill, who's now supervising those bees. All right. So that is a very functionalistic, a very managerial or pragmatic approach to communication and also to storytelling. And then storytelling becomes reduced to being a tool where information is wrapped in a beautiful way and hopefully sticks with people much more than compared to giving them the numbers. On the other hand, as communication scholars, we know that there is more to communication, because communication is not just about transmitting information from A to B. Communication is about sense making. When we communicate, we create and co-create our understanding of the world, how things out there work, how things happen, how people behave, how a certain context or situation can be, interpreted. So then storytelling gets a very different, or a stronger impact, or there's much more potential to storytelling than compared to if we just want to use it as a tool, as a communication instrument. What I learned by capturing sustainability related stories in my research is that what really sticks with people is if something irritates them, if something provokes them, if something really cracks their norms or their patterns of behavior and understanding and processing the world. So if a story is just this example of someone doing something really irritating where you feel disrupted in kind of how you approach the world so far, then that creates resonance. And this is basically what communication and sustainability communication is about, creating resonance to then potentially impacting behavior and changing behavior.
Yes, I agree to a certain extent, but I would add to this also that I think also positive stories stick if it is connected to something which gives a pleasurable memory as such. To give you one example, in our garden we planted a fig bush. We thought at the time it was a small fig bush. We planted it 20 years ago, and some of my friends were laughing at us. They said, wow, how come? Why would you think a fig would, survive? I'm speaking now about a garden in Hungary where, there used to be heavy winters and so on. Now, I tell you, last year, we had something like 30 kilograms of figs, an
Wow.
incredible amount. It's just thriving like crazy. And the weather adapted. And of course, now I say that we foresaw it. Of course, we didn't foresee how the climate is warming, but somehow we responded to this or preempted this. Obviously, there are other stories which go in the other direction, that fruits, plants, bushes that used to thrive and live well, they suffer because of summer heat or not having enough cold in the winter, and so on and so on. So positive stories as well as those, and I agree here, those that provoke people and make them feel even angry, if that is the case, that can work well. And perhaps if they are angry, that might resonate them also and bring them to act on certain things, wouldn't it?
I think that's one way to look at it, but provocation or irritation doesn't need to be negative, or doesn't need, so this is not what I meant before, because an irritation or provocation can be also a confrontation with someone who really goes into a very extreme behavior, for example, which you then kind of learn about through a story. And then you feel like, oh, okay, that was pretty extreme. I wouldn't go that far. However, if this person did this, I can at least go a bit further than I potentially would go if I wouldn't have listened to this story, or if I wouldn't have this example. So I think one of the best examples is the Fridays for Future movement. So this is a bit kind of larger scale here, not individual behavior, but the Friday for Future movement and those protests that started with Greta Thunberg in Sweden, they were really revolutionary. People, like, there was so much discussion all around the world, students, and this was really relevant, and there was a lot of debate and a lot of controversy and polarization about it. And then there was another group forming, and they were called Extinction rebellions. For example, in Australia, they were called the Last Generation in the German-speaking countries, which is pretty provoking. If a group of people says we are the last generation, because that is really performative, or even counterformative, because you can't really, if this is the last generation, what to do then? And they went even more extreme, because they glued themselves on the roads to stop the cars from going in the morning, and all the commuters got really, really angry, and a massive uproar. And since this was even more extreme, or even far more extreme than the Fridays for Future movement with their protest was, suddenly the Fridays for Future movement became more moderate. And people tell, like, oh yeah, I can go like with the Fridays people, like I can do that. That's not too extreme. But why did this happen? Because the Last Generation or Extinction rebellions, they were even more extreme. So I think it doesn't need to be an irritation in terms of creating anger or fear or kind of big emotions. I think as long as we have people sharing and telling their stories, to people and organizations and groups of people and collectives and communities doing something really extraordinary, being a pioneer somewhere, they are opening a lot of scope for at least a bit more revolutionary action.
Yeah, I understand. And that in a way actually changes the norms, and something which was not acceptable becomes acceptable, and something which was, at the extreme might not be the extreme any longer. I remember some of the stories also with Extinction Rebellion here in the UK, and some of them are quite frightening, shocking, absolutely provoking. And I guess that was the purpose. So
It's
clearly, they made their mark. For a moment, I would like to bring back our thought now on how climate awareness is perceived. And I want to tie in a new player into our discussion, and that is companies. I came across a piece of research from YouGov, which does reliable and competent and impactful piece of research here in the UK. And in an international piece of research that they conducted 2 years ago, they claimed that 55% of global consumers are skeptical of brands' sustainability claims. So in a way, they believe, in other words, that much of it is greenwashing, and actually what brands are doing are not really credible. Now, how do you see the situation now with companies' behavior, attitudes, and communications around sustainability, and specifically around their claims of being sustainable and climate friendly?
Yeah, I think that's a very good and very relevant question, because this is where we always end up with talking about those big polluters and corporations and organizations and their responsibility, because they're definitely kind of the cause of a lot of the climate crisis and related problems, and therefore they do hold a certain responsibility. What I find really interesting is that, again, kind of two different perspectives to look at this. So one is the greenwashing perspective, or the concept of greenwashing that is so familiar to people that they easily hop on it and say, like, oh yeah.
By now, absolutely, it has become a household term.
Totally, I know, yeah. So that is all around. And I think, like, from a public communication or public sphere theoretical perspective, I would say I'm really happy that we're having these greenwashing discussions, because we need those wrongdoings as a society to then kind of recalibrate our normative frameworks to say, oh yeah, no, like this is what I find morally really wrong, and this is the right behavior. Because if I don't think about it, I don't really mind. But if there are those few kind of cases where there is wrongdoing, then again, from a broader societal or public sphere perspective, then the society really needs to recalibrate their normative frameworks and their kind of morality, what is right, what is wrong. So therefore, I wouldn't say the whole greenwashing topic and that it's around and all that is too bad. However, of course, now kind of shifting the perspective on corporates and where we are at the moment, I think the world has changed so quickly over the past 2 years, I'd say, because where organizations, especially kind of larger corporates, big brands, they think about their responsibility towards the society since the late 80s. So energy corporations were the first ones. Of course, they had to think about their environmental impact. It was all about global warming by that time. And then came kind of the whole phase, the early 2000s, where they actively tried to be a good corporate citizen, where they actually tried to be responsible towards the society, which was then labeled as corporate social responsibility. Now we are in a very, very different place, because 2015, the SDGs came up, a lot of policies, a lot of regulations, at least in Europe. And organizations are, this whole taking responsibility is so institutionalized these days that I think there's no company that would say, you know what, we're doing things, and then at the very end we talk a bit about like how amazing we are in terms of our green whatever behavior. So this kind of this tiny little like communication or corporate communication being the cherry on top at the very end, I think these times are really over, because organizations of all kind and scope and shape, they have to think about this much, much earlier. they need to consider and negotiate what sustainability means for them. And I think now, especially after 25 and a massive backlash in terms of diversity and sustainability agendas, I think it becomes very, very obvious who was in the camp of, we have this person, this comms person, and she will kind of create this report and it's all good and we hand it over to the rating agencies and we don't really care. And the ones who made sustainability part of their DNA. So I think this becomes pretty clear, which doesn't mean, again, just like one more half sentence, which doesn't mean that all the greenwashing debates will be eliminated. That doesn't mean that all the wrongdoing suddenly stops. But I think it becomes now very obvious who are the ones that still stick with those agendas, that still talk about their responsibility and sustainability and related issues, and the ones who say, we're better silence.
That's great if there is such a distillation going on and filtering of those who just, paid lip service to this issue of being sustainable or not. In the meanwhile, a lot of social challenges have emerged. So, for example, when I speak to my students here in the UK, on a number of occasions, it comes up that they cannot afford to actually look for products which are sustainable because the number one critical issue for them is affordability of the product. And the big question is, can I pay for it? And it's only secondary or tertiary or wherever whether the product, what impact the product makes on the environment or how socially sustainable it is. I'm a bit concerned that we are not able to develop that toolkit, and this would need to be a very complex exercise, a toolkit that would help young people make the right decisions. And by right decision, I mean right for the wallet, as well as right for the society and climate on a longer term.
Again, now I agree to a certain extent with what you said, because yes, there is this big question mark when it comes to sustainable consumption in terms of sustainable products are always super expensive. It's an elite thing. It's only the ones who can afford it. They can actually be green. But I'm not quite sure. I think those young people are much ahead of what we imagine where they are. And my feeling is that there is a certain reframing happening of what sustainability or sustainable consumption actually is. Because I think, I know that you would immediately think of the famous fair trade chocolate that costs 3 times what like a normal non-fair trade chocolate costs. But I think they are more conscious, far more conscious, and there are new ways to look at consumption. So I'm just thinking about my own kids and their friends and how they navigate all that. And they are really into health. They are really into sports, and they have made very conscious decisions. And it's maybe not the label with bio, green, eco, sustainable, blah, blah, climate friendly, climate neutral, and everything that is not allowed anymore. All those fluffy terms. They don't fall for that, but they make very conscious consumption decisions. And for example, buying local food, buying seasonal food is something that is very easy and that doesn't cost more.
You're right. And in fact, I think this also has an effect on sustainability messaging, because very often speaking about health or speaking about work-life balance or speaking about, let's say, local food can actually generate action much better than if we were speaking about, what impact it makes on the climate.
Yeah.
So in a way, the direct benefits of being climate aware are the trigger words and the trigger terms that often work with young people. Yeah.
And I think maybe I can add one aspect that I find particularly important. It really matters from where you are. It really matters what sustainability means for you. Because I'm in my classroom and, of course, doing research in sustainability for quite a while now and dealing with that from so many aspects. I come along with this kind of massive egghead full of concepts and ideas and things what sustainability is. And then I'm confronted with, just random example, a student from the Ukraine who says, yeah, cool stuff. And we do have sustainability as a term in our language, but it basically means rational decision making. You're just rational. You wouldn't throw away an empty jam jar. You wouldn't do it because it's just irrational to do it. It's a resource. And then, all your concepts as the teacher and someone doing all the research suddenly get deconstructed. And you feel like, oh, yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
It is super easy by the end of the day. And this is what I meant.
Yeah,
Conscious decisions, rationality. Just kind of think logically. Is it really worth it? Do I really need that? It's very, very simple. And it's very similar if you talk to people from other contexts. I had a girl from Korea sitting in my classroom and articulating very, very interesting and very similar, sharing their interpretations of sustainability. So therefore, I think this cultural perspective on how we look at consumption, how we look at products, how we deal with that, how we actually manage our everyday life, that matters much, much more than the labels and where we feel like, oh, no, this fair trade label, that's gone.
Yeah, I love these examples, and actually just beautifully fitting in the line. Last year, one of my students from Brazil said, when we discussed what is the most surprising thing for them in the UK in terms of sustainability and so on, and she mentioned that she is shocked that in England, people peel every vegetable and fruit. And she said, why, let's take the most simple example, a carrot. Why do you peel the carrot? Wash it. You don't need to peel it. And she says that in Brazil, in her home country, they eat the peel of almost every fruit and every vegetable. There are one or two exceptions, obviously, but even the peel of the pineapple can be used for certain purposes, she mentioned. So it is, again, be logical, be rational, as exactly as you said.
Yeah.
Now I have one more question that refers to one of the pieces of research that you are doing, and I'm really interested in hearing in a nutshell around this, and that is around climate-related journalism. And I know that you, I believe, with a colleague, wrote a chapter in the Climate Crisis Communication Handbook of Routledge last year, and there you mentioned that climate-related journalism needs to be set on new grounds. What is wrong with climate journalism, in your view?
I think there are like a lot of really good things happening. If you look at The Guardian, if you kind of check the public broadcasters in many, many countries, they're really good, creative, wonderful storytelling, wonderful reporting is going on there. So I don't really specifically talk about that. What I'm really concerned about, or at least thinking, if our normative idea of what a journalist should do still stands in these crazy, crazy crisis times. I do believe that we need more people who actually speak up, knowing that there's a very thin line to this very opinionated journalism and all the fake news, all the disinformation and all that. I think this kind of value driven and value guided people that actually take a stance, that are very conscious about the communicative and narrative agency they hold. I think this is something that we are somehow missing. I'm not quite sure, meanwhile, since I wrote this chapter some time passed by, I'm not quite sure if it's only the journalist or if it's really something that we should put on the journalist's shoulders. My feeling is that there are other communicator roles, hidden communicator roles, or hidden like agents that are so far invisible that need to be more articulated. And I'm particularly thinking about those new roles in organizations and especially corporates, like sustainability officers, sustainability managers. But by the same time, I think everyone knows in the classroom, in the university, in the organization you as a listener work for, you know the people that you would go to if you need someone speaking about waste and recycling or biking or, hey, train instead of airplanes, or well-being or social care or whatever the sustainability issue is. You know those people, you know the agents, because they deal with that. And so basically everyone holds a certain agency, and everyone has the potential to become a change agent from a communication perspective. So I don't mean change agent in terms of, oh, I'm not buying any clothes anymore and I'm doing this, and I'm not doing this anymore, I'm not this anymore. But change agent from a communication perspective, making a point, articulating standpoints, potentially provoking, irritating people for them to move forward in their thinking, to wake up, to create awareness and all of that. So I could go on and go on. But
yeah, and that is no problem. But right away, I thought about our role. You and I both teach at the university. And is this also valid regarding our role and agency?
Yeah,
should we be provoking? Should we be encouraging our students to take action, to take a stand, and so on?
Absolutely, 150% yes. There's a wonderful paper written by our colleagues Annabella Cavallo, Michael Brüggemann from Germany, and more wonderful colleagues who specifically look at academics and scholars and saying, hey, guys, we're still standing at the sidelines. And this is something that can directly be translated into like a very, very important question for us, which is who are we and how do we teach? What kind of pedagogies do we want to apply, like, and use? How do we see the classroom? How do we see these interactions? How do we approach that? How do we actually step on our students' toes to make them think differently? And in my teaching evaluations, I think this is the most beautiful sentence that I get is, oh my God, that was really different, which I love, because that is exactly my purpose. Because, the knowledge is all around. They can just pull it from everywhere. The information is out there. I can offer my students certain concepts to make sense out of all the stuff out there, and I can step on their toes. Which I try to do.
I fully understand what you're saying. I myself also experience a competition on a daily basis, competition for the attention of my students, competition with all the other sources of information they can have on their, on their screen, on their social media sites, just talking to friends and so on. And it is in this competition that, I need to stand out, be different, provide something valuable, give an insight or a perspective they would not find otherwise. It is a challenge, I think, for our education, for sure. All right, I would like to invite you in the next couple of minutes to a little game. And the game goes the following way. This is our 5th episode of Ready, Steady, Green. And I would like to bring here a couple of terms that start with the 5th letter of the alphabet, with letter E. And I'm curious to hear from you in max 1 minute each. what associations these bring to your mind in relation to sustainability. Okay, so each of them will start with the letter E, and thoughts, associations that come to your mind, in a couple of sentences. So the first one is emergency.
All around us, there is emergency, and nature does speak to us and makes this very clear, I think, at the moment.
And what does nature tell us? What do you refer to?
That there is a climate emergency, and that we need to wake up and really change our behavior. That is very, I know, very like normative and dogmatic, but
no, it is not.
It is an emergency, and I think this is really important. Like, we shouldn't talk about climate change anymore. It's a crisis.
I agree. All right. So the next term I would like to bring here is ethical investment.
It resonates in a way that I observe that there are more options to invest in shares that are somehow related to companies, products, industries, blah, blah, that are somehow doing better than others. However, ethical investment in itself, it's a pretty wicked term, because I think ethical from a sustainability perspective means that you don't subordinate it to the big progress narrative of money will grow, capitalism, we need to invest more. So, of course, it creates a little bit of a hiccup in me to combine those words. But by the same time, I know that there's a lot of good stuff happening in sustainable shares and in sustainable investments.
Well, thank you for sharing your reservations and your hiccup in this field. I understand exactly what you mean here. And there's a third term, which is very much your home ground, but I'm interested in your view around ESG, which is more or less a household term by now for anyone who is dealing with sustainability and somehow related to organizations and companies. So ESG, what does this bring to your mind?
So ESG is an acronym that is, I think it's quite funny, because we had such a long time reducing sustainability and all the corporate social responsibility thinking to this world famous triple bottom line of environmental and social and then economic responsibility or sustainability. And I think we got much further. There are so many different ways to look at it these days. And so I found it, by the time the term really made it on the agenda of corporates and then, of course, the public agenda, my feeling, I was quite irritated, because I do understand that, of course, now it's environmental and social and governance. And the idea behind the concept is a bit different, and of course not a replacement of the triple bottom line, because it brings in this governance aspect and therefore this managerial approach and this deep understanding relating to what I said before, that sustainability must be in the DNA of an organization. Speaking to organizations and corporates, and everyone is struggling with these massive tensions between stakeholder expectations, all the regulations and the ESG related policies, and then those massive scorecards of rating agencies. Like, that is a lot of stuff. And so I find this ESG label quite reductionist, but I can kind of give you this little rant here because I'm a communication person working on an institute with a lot of linguists. So a bit of ranting about the terminology needs to be allowed.
However, to the credit of the term ESG, it is true that there are not many terms where, let's say, the communications industry was successful in, creating a household name. And today ESG is used, well, of course, in different contexts and in different interpretations, but nevertheless, they do indicate a direction about the overall responsibilities a company should have and should actually live up to. So I
Totally.
think
I didn't want to dismiss it.
no, you did not, and I also gather that there are controversies around this, and again, maybe 10 years ago, ESG was higher on the agenda than it is today for a number of reasons. It is actually responding and meeting ESG expectations has become so complex and widespread, and just simply by looking at stakeholder expectations and meeting them, it is very complex. It drains a lot of organizational resources, and simply therefore it's not easy to manage. I fully agree to that. Good. Now, in the last couple of minutes, what I would like to do is to invite you to a bit of daydreaming. And the daydreaming is about, an ideal world, and we would all love to live in an ideal world. So if you were to live in an ideal world, what, from your perspective, what should individual people be doing regarding climate change or a climate emergency, as you rather said? So what is the responsibility of the individuals here?
Probably the toughest question of our conversation. I think the core is to question and to reflect on everything that you experience and that you stumble over and that you're confronted with. Don't take anything for granted or for given. I might give you an example that relates to our role as academics, as scholars, as working at a university. I had a wonderful conversation with my boss, the rector of the university I'm working for at the moment. And he said, you know what, we're doing so many good things. It's a new university, amazing campus, like lots of sustainability related initiatives, solar panels, the heating system is amazing, lots of wonderful things, like good stuff. Still, of course, they need to buy out certain CO2 emissions. But he said, like, if you put all of that in a big pile of sustainability related engagement, what matters the most is those academics flying to conferences. So all the travel, that kicks in to an extent. He said, I can't even think of all my heating or my waste management or my solar panels, all that. That kicks in. So what I don't have a solution for that because I'm still part of the game. But so it's not about like this one academic saying, okay, I'm not flying anymore. But firstly, this one academic who's not flying anymore does something because he confronts everyone else to at least have this moment of hesitation, this moment of irritation, saying, yeah, What is even more important, and here we get into the daydreaming, is to actually question these things on a more systematic level. Mm-hmm. Like, why are we defined by the number of presentations that we give and the internationality? You know, if this is a metric, if this is a parameter that defines us, but again, kind of bringing us maybe also back to where we started talking a bit more about storytelling, why those tiny little examples matter. This one person who does things differently might be very alone, is potentially confronted with some problems, but by the same time opens up for other people then the scope to at least act slightly different, maybe reduce half of the flights or whatever. So it's a pretty kind of random and topic that's always discussed again, I know, but it works really well as an example. And I think, therefore, what I basically mean daydreaming is it's not about the single choices that you make. It's about a general approach to really put things into question. Everything that's required from you, all the parameters you use to define yourself and to create your own identity in this world. Question them.
This, what you just shared, resonated with me very strongly because my 80% of my carbon footprint, my individual carbon footprint, is from flying. I did the test. There are a couple of tests available on the internet. I did the one with WWF, simply inputting, what I do in my daily life, how I commute, what I eat, how I heat, and clothing and so on. And 80% comes from the couple of flights that I take. It's shocking. It is. All right, moving on. What should organizations and businesses be doing in an ideal world, in your interpretation? What should they be doing differently if they wanted to act on climate change, climate emergency?
I strongly believe that, but here it's me speaking from a communication perspective and not from a business or economics perspective. What I can say from what I know and from my looking at organizations with my background and my perspectives is that what is missing, and therefore what I would suggest to do more, is to open up spaces internally to put things into question, to renegotiate things, because not everything needs to be taken for granted. And to really avoid what is still happening, that a strategy is put in place top down, but rather develop ideas and projects and engagement areas and all of that from the bottom up. So therefore, you need spaces where people can talk about what sustainability actually means for them before just buying in ESG concepts and strategies and policies. It needs to be talked about within the organization, and therefore organizations need to open up those kind of alternative or third spaces, or however you want to conceptualize them, to renegotiate those very basic principles that this organization wants to be guided by.
Are you referring to some kind of buy-in from the people within that organization?
Rather giving them a voice.
Mm-hmm.
And like creating these spaces which are not information-based, but really focused on discussion and debate, and as I said, a renegotiation, or at least an openness to reevaluate what an organization stands for, what the core values are, and what the interpretations of responsibility, sustainability, crisis are.
I see. Thank you. And the last one in this row, and you might guess what the third actor is in this series. I'm interested in your view about what governments should be doing differently if they really wanted to act on climate emergency.
I think I need to pass that one on to you. I'll give it back to you because I don't really have an answer to that. This is really something that leaves me rather speechless at the moment. I can't really say.
If it is your question, I could respond by quoting some of my earlier guests. Mm-hmm. And maybe there are three typical thoughts that have come up. One, and especially with discussions with two of them on the most recent COP30 in Brazil, there was a level of disillusion and disappointment, and framing it that governments should be more bold and brave and get away from this, hustle and whatever bargaining around the table, and rather look at the big picture and be brave enough to make decisions based on values and the big picture. So this was one interesting and important thought. The second one very bluntly said that politicians should be listening more to the scientists, and the big difficulty being that politicians, or most politicians, only have a 4 years time frame to think about, while scientists and the science of climate, among other things, has a much longer time frame. So, take the right perspective on things. And the third one was, and actually this relates to what you just previously said, was listen to your own people much stronger than you actually do, and acknowledge the fact that climate change, through its effect on the individual people in having difficulties in heating or cooling their home, having issues related to affordable food, health-related issues and so on. It just means that governments should be more open to listening to the voices of their own people and the people who live there, because after all, they need to represent their voices and their interests.
Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you, actually, and thank you for sharing all these thoughts. And I really liked a lot what you were speaking about, a higher level of actionism, if there is such a term, being more provocative and encouraging everyone to be more open and ask questions, and in a way question the status quo and reframe things that they like. So thank you so much for joining today. It was wonderful to have you as a guest. And
thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to all the listeners on this podcast today. If you liked it, please make sure to follow it on your favorite podcast platform, share it with your friends, and invite others to listen to it as well. You can also listen to our earlier episodes, and feel free to send me a message if you would like to invite someone specifically as the next guest. Help us get the message through that we all need to act on sustainability now. So this was Gabor Sarlos with Ready, Steady, Green. Bye for now.